Hey everyone, I'm Corey, the host of the Melanin Wellness Podcast, and you're listening to the How to Podcast series with your host, Dave. If you are a podcaster or thinking about starting a podcast, then you have arrived at the perfect place. On this podcast, expect to hear practical tips, actionable steps, all broken down into digestible, bite-sized pieces to help you make your podcast better. I'm speaking from experience because I listen to the How to Podcast series regularly, and I've taken the steps that Dave gives, and I have watched my show grow tremendously in a relatively short time. So welcome to the How to Podcast series. Dave, take it away, my friend.
Hey, welcome back to the How to Podcast series. It's Dave. I'm glad to have you back with me. I'm glad to have a few moments with you today to talk about something that isn't what it appears to be. And it is a term called Podfade. Now, Podfade is simply podcasting and fading away combined into one word. You get Podfade. And what's happening is we're lumping a lot of different things under the banner of Podfade, which is actually causing more confusion, and I think some people are really getting down on themselves because they feel like they are pod fading when maybe they're not. Maybe they aren't pod fading at all. And they feel like they're disappointing their audience. They feel like they're disappointing themselves. They're getting down on themselves and thinking, oh man, I can't make this thing work, so I must be pod fading. I want to dispel some of the things that are not pod fade. They're not actually elements of pod fading, and maybe a little bit about how the numbers around what people say is people pod fading are not actually true numbers. So I want to give you a little bit of hope here that you might not actually be pod fading at all. You might be unfairly put into a container with the big word Podfade on it, and you don't belong there. So let's talk a little bit about what Podfade isn't. Limited series, mini podcasts, and breaks. They might not actually be examples of Podfade after all. Let's get into this. Podfade is actually often misunderstood. In all the circles of podcasting and all the Facebook groups and all the conversation around podcasting, Podfade is a term thrown around quite frequently, and I don't think people really understand what Podfade isn't. These are elements of things that people mistake for Podfade, but they really aren't. They actually for me, when I look at podcasting, these feel like they're outside of that label of Podfade. And the one thing we need to say right off the bat is Podfade doesn't mean failure. And that's one thing that I think a lot of people equate, that if you don't continue your show, if you take a break, if something changes, you failed as a podcaster. Therefore, you've pod faded. And there's like this stigma around it that people don't brag about their pod fades. And I think a lot of people are getting confused about what is and what isn't a pod fade. And again, living under this assumption that they're failing if they don't keep up with the Joneses in podcasting. There's a lot of different scenarios that don't actually fit the term Podfade. Podfade specifically refers to a podcast that gradually or suddenly stops publishing new episodes without a planned conclusion or an official announcement that the podcast is now ended. I've kind of expanded on explanation of what Podfade isn't. I hope this gives some clarity around Podfade and maybe releases a little bit of the stress you might be under, that maybe you didn't Podfade at all. So what Podfade isn't? Podfade is not a limited series or a podcast that has a planned ending. One of the most popular podcasts back in the day when podcasting was relatively young was Serial, not the kind you eat on Saturday morning when you watch the cartoons, but Serial as far as like murders and stuff. I've never listened to the show. I'm not really a true crime person because there's enough crime in the news. I don't need to actually listen to a podcast about it for me personally. I don't go there. So yeah, I don't really listen to that show. And technically, because that show is so old without new episodes, fits the definition, the broad definition of Podfade, because it's faded away. It's not recording new episodes on a consistent basis going forward every week, every 2 weeks, twice a week, 5 days a week. It's pod-faded by definition. Therefore, would you say that the Serial podcast is a failure? No, because it's still being listened to by people all over the world, and it's still active from a listener's perspective. So technically, with no new episodes, it isn't pod-faded at all. It's just not producing new episodes. It's still an active podcast. It still has evergreen content, and people are still enjoying it. Therefore, it hasn't pod-faded. Podfade does not include podcasts that are designed as a limited series, such as a show with a set number of episodes. For example, they have a 10-part educational series framed as a podcast, delivered as a podcast, but it's only got 10 episodes. Maybe it's got 5 episodes. And in that, it's got a beginning, middle, and end, and therefore, when it reaches the end, it's over, and the podcast is complete, and we move on. Books have a beginning, middle, and end. They've got multiple chapters, but a book doesn't go on forever and ever and ever. It has an ending and conclusion. There might be series of books where there's one book leads into the next, but a book is a book. Otherwise, the author was never done finishing the book. A book has an ending. A movie has an ending. A song has an ending. A conversation has an ending. And podcasts have endings. And there's no shame in having a podcast that's a short run, 5, 10, 15 episode arc that has a beginning, middle, and end. That is not pod fading. That is a completed podcast. An audiobook is not a pod faded book. An audio fade, it would be pod fade, audio fade, in that the audiobook's over. And it's like, well, that sucks. Then I guess we'll never listen to that audiobook again. Audiobooks live in the world. They don't just continue forever. An audiobook is a standalone project. Multiple chapters. It's a good example of a podcast. An audiobook is very similar in that context. It has a beginning, middle, and end. And podcasts that have a short run episode length and episode number of episodes, that's not pod fading. That's a completed thought, a completed podcast. These shows have a clear beginning, middle, and end. Both the creator and the audience know from the start, this show will conclude at a certain point. That is not pod fade. That's evergreen content. And if you feel like you fit in the pod fade bucket because you have a short run podcast, you're wrong. You're actually wrong. You did not pod fade. You completed a project and you moved on to the next thing. Just like an author. Authors aren't failing when they finish their book. Authors then move on to the next book. That's how it works. You're not fading if you have a short run podcast episode length, number of episodes over a short period of time, and you're done. That is not pod fading. And what happens is these short run podcasts with 5, 10, 15 episodes, beginning, middle, and end, completed podcasts, get lumped into the bucket of pod fade because there's no new episodes. There are no new episodes because the podcast is over. And it's meant to live evergreen content into the future as a beginning, middle, and end. 5 episodes, 10 episodes, 15 episodes, 20, and it's over. The podcast is over, and then they start another one. That is not pod fading. So if you have done a short run podcast, you haven't pod faded. You've completed your show. Congratulations, you haven't pod faded. Another example of what isn't a pod fade, not taking a break or going on hiatus. When you take a break and take a walk away from your show for a period of time, that is not pod fade. I don't do seasons for this podcast. I just keep creating content because A, I have too much to say, and B, I just don't do seasons. That's just not how I do my show. If you do seasons, that's great. I'm happy for you. Remember, we did an episode in the past. We talked about having a reason for the season. You need a reason to do your podcast. And seasons, don't just do it because you think everyone else is, because everyone doing it is an absolute, and that's not true. Again, I don't do seasons, and I'm part of the everyone's, that podcast. So don't feel like you have to do seasons just because you think everyone is. You need a reason for your season. For me, taking a break from my podcast is not failure. It's called taking care of my mental health. It's called family changes. It's called a change at work. It's called holidays. It's called I need a nap. And I don't think too many people who consume your free podcast are going to complain that you're not providing something for free they don't pay for, and they're upset with you for not giving them the free thing. Now, if they're paying you to do this and it's your job, that's a different thing. But for the majority, 80, 90% of podcasters, this isn't a job. This is our passion. This is our fun. This is our hobby. This is our side project. We are the majority, and we're not being paid to do any of this, and we're not accountable to anybody. We don't have to record an episode. You taking a week off is not pod fading. It's not. So if you need a break, you don't need to do seasons to take breaks. You can take a break whenever you want to, and nobody's going to get upset with you. Nobody's going to take your podcast away. The only thing I would say is just let your audience know because they care about you, not because you owe them anything. You don't owe your listeners a thing, but they love you. They care about you. They want to be there for you, and they have a companionship relationship with you as a listener to the host. And when you're gone, they miss you. So if you're going to take an extended break, then let them know. But if you miss a week of your show, you have not failed. I hear gurus that say if you miss 1 week, you failed. As a podcaster, never ever miss a week. That pressure is unbearable. You don't have to live under that. This is your podcast. You can take as many breaks as you want. You can do seasons. You don't have to do seasons. You can take a break. It's not pod fading. It's your health. This is a podcast. We're not doing brain surgery here. Even if it's a podcast about brain surgery, you're not actually doing the brain surgery. So nobody is going to be hurt or hospitalized because you didn't record this week's episode. Okay? So take a break. You're not pod fading. You're not part of that big, massive number that is put in front of us saying, look at all the failures in podcasting. You're not part of that number. You haven't pod faded because you need a break. Structured breaks, whether they're announced as seasonal breaks or recharges due to your personal needs, are not considered pod fade. As long as the podcaster communicates with the intention and giving some timing about when I'm coming back to the best of your ability, because your audience loves you, it's not pod fading. Pod fading is also is not a pivot or a rebrand. If your show changes format, changes focus, changes how it does what it does on the podcast, and then takes a brief pause to relaunch, do new artwork, refocus, come back different, better than it was before, that is not pod fading. Those are just like slapping some paint on the wall of your house to make your room look a little nicer. That's all it is. The house is still the house. You just did some updates. You got some nice throw pillows, new carpet, some paint on the wall. You're done. That's what you're doing to your show. You're just giving it a little facelift, a little extra. So a pivot, a rebrand, that is not pod fading. It's not. You're just changing what you do. And you can do this as often as you want. Not everybody does it. Just keep that in mind. So don't believe that when you hear somebody say that everybody rebrands their show. No. This show has never been rebranded. It's the same from day one as it is today. And I'm up to 483 episodes plus all the other unnumbered episodes. Way over 500 episodes here on the show. Never rebranded. Still the same all the way through. That's how I do my show. I like what it sounds like. I like how it's working. And I like that you're here. So I'm not going to change anything. So not everybody does this. Not everybody pivots or rebrands their show. But if you do, that is not Podfade. The evolution of a podcast is part of your creative growth as a podcaster. And if done openly and intentionally, it's not seen as podfading. Podfade is not failure. In general terms, podfade is not failure. Podfade isn't a catch-all term for all types of podcast endings or unsuccessful shows. Many podcasts end intentionally. They're retired with a farewell episode or simply meant to be a short-term project, a short-term podcast, and a finish line is in sight for that podcast. All of this does not fit under the banner of a pod-faded show. So if you feel like that's you haven't pod-faded. You didn't. Your show came to a natural conclusion and you ended it. It's done. It's time to go move on to a new project. What else interests you? Go create a new show. You don't have to run 9 shows at a time like I'm doing, but you could have 9 different shows, all with 5-10 episodes, and you chase your fancy, whatever you like. It could be one show could be about business and accounting. The next show could be about raising cows on your farm. And the next one could be about children, raising your kids. The next one would be about investing in your future financially. You could do all these different shows unrelated to each other. The only common thing is you. And when people find a podcaster they love, they tend to follow you into the other areas of your life that you want to talk about. You don't have to run these all simultaneously, all at the same time, all of these different shows like I'm doing. You can do a show, end the show, start a new show, and chase that one. You can do this as many times as you want. There's no rules. If you want to have multiple shows under one paid plan, my suggestion is Captivate.fm. That's where I am for many of my shows. You can have multiple shows under one paid plan every month. It's really great. And they're really great people over at Captivate. So if you're interested in doing multiple shows about different topics and you want those podcasts when they come to completion to stay and be active, try something like Captivate.fm. It's a really great group over there, and I'll put a link in my show notes for you to go check them out. That's where I host a lot of my shows. So you can chase podcasts and make as many shows as you want. It's not pod fading to start, continue, and then end a show. You have not pod faded. And when you scale down your show, that also does not mean you're pod fading. When you reduce the frequency, like how many podcast episodes you do a month, from like weekly to twice a month to once a month, for example, you're not pod fading. You're not. You don't fit the definition of pod fade by simply reducing the amount of output you do. You went from a daily show to a weekly show. Did you pod fade? No. You went from 1 episode a month to 1 every 2 months. You went from 12 episodes a year to 6. Is that pod fading? No. You're still podcasting, right? It's the frequency is not an indication of pod fading. It's not. When you slow down your show, that can be a part of your conscious change in the production, and it does not match with Podfade's disappearance without closure moniker. That's what Podfade is. Disappearance without closure. There's no ending. There's no completeness. There's nothing to it. You just go away. And when podcasters leave their show and fade away, your audience also will fade away. They'll move on to something else and replace you with someone else and maybe even forget about you. There's the harm in pod fading, when it's a disappearance without closure. That's the key point in pod fading. So if you haven't disappeared and you haven't closed your show with a logical ending, you don't fit the moniker of pod fading. And you're not grouped in to a large number that's shared online of people who have failed as podcasters because they've disappeared without closure. if you have fallen into any of the things we've talked about today, you haven't podfaded. So you're not failing. You're just in a spot in your life and in your career and in your podcast where you just need to take care of you and take care of what's going on around you. Remember, people love you. People come to your show because they love you. And the more you show up, the better for them and for you, because you'll improve. But when you need a break, when your podcast comes to a logical conclusion, you've talked about this subject all the way through to the end, just like a book has a beginning, middle, and end. Your podcast can have a beginning, middle, and end, and you have not podfaded. You've completed your job, you completed your podcast, and you can move on to new things. You're not a failure in podcasting. Podfade is not something that affects everybody, but people who disappear without closure are the people who podfade. If you want to avoid disappearing on your audience without closure and you need some help, reach out to me at howtopodcast.ca. Let's have a conversation. Calendar's always there for you. SpeakPipe's always there for you. Anytime. I'd love to have a conversation with you about your show, whether it is time to close the show and move on to something else, or maybe we can re-spark your love for the show that you had when you first started. It comes in conversation. Don't try to do this on your own. Reach out to somebody who really does care about you. I care about you, and I'd love to help you with your show at howtopodcast.ca. It's always free, always ready there for you, and I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for hitting play. You haven't podfaded. You haven't podfaded, okay? You haven't failed. You're still doing it. Keep going. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep sharing your voice. If you need help, anytime, reach out. I'd love to talk to you. Hey, thanks for being here. Thank you for listening to the end of the podcast. You're here with me. I'm so grateful. I want to put something in front of you. For the person that's listened this far, you're my new best friend. So what I'm trying to do every month is I have a goal, and you can help me with this goal. Very simple. What I'm trying to do is have 5 conversations this month with listeners of the How to Podcast series. You don't have to have a podcast to respond. This can be the first time ever that we're going to have a conversation, but I'm looking to talk to 5 people. Now, you're still here, so you're one of the people that I would love to talk to next. So on my howtopodcast.ca website is a calendar, and I'd love to have you respond on howtopodcast.ca. Just click the calendar link, set up time in my calendar, and in the comments section for the meeting, just put something like listener. That's it. If you have a show, put it in the comments too so I can go listen. But if you don't, I just want to talk to 5 listeners every month from now to the end of the month. So if you're listening to me right now, you're the person I want to talk to. And through howtopodcast.ca, you and I can get together, chat about the show, chat about your journey as a podcaster. Where are you at? What do you need this show to become for you? What's missing? Your feedback. I just want to meet you. And as podcasters, I would encourage you to do something similar to this in your podcast so that you can meet and interact with your audience. So, howtopodcast.ca, I'm looking to talk to 5 people every month, and I would love for you to be one of them. Reach out. It's free. I'm not selling you anything. I just want to talk to you at howtopodcast.ca. Let's get in the calendar and chat. Thanks for listening.